The paramedics were halfway through loading my wife Eleanor into the ambulance when the shrieking started. They had the oxygen mask on her face and were monitoring her vitals when this piercing voice cut through everything. Stop. Stop everything right now. You are in violation of Section 4.2 of the Maple Grove HOA bylaws. I turned to see our HOA president, Dolores Kensington, charging across my lawn in her signature purple blazer and 4-in heels, waving a clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. The EMTs froze for a second, confused. I didn't freeze. I stepped, right between Dolores and the stretcher where my wife was fighting to breathe properly. Dolores jabbed her manicured finger at the ambulance. That emergency vehicle is not pre-approved for entry into this community. You're all trespassing on private HOA property. The lead paramedic looked at her like she'd grown a second head. Ma'am, we're responding to a 911 call. This woman needs immediate medical attention. But Dolores wasn't backing down. She pulled out her phone and started recording. I'm calling HOA security right now. This is an unauthorized vehicle entry, and I will have you all arrested. By the time this nightmare week was over, Dolores would be the one in handcuffs, charged with obstruction of emergency services, public endangerment, and violating 3 different city ordinances she always claimed to enforce. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. My name is Daniel Patterson, and I'm 37 years old. I work as a financial consultant, mostly from home. My wife Eleanor is 35, teaches piano lessons to kids in the neighborhood, and has a congenital heart condition that requires careful monitoring. We moved to Maple Grove Estates 3 years ago, thinking the quiet, gated community would be perfect for us. Maple Grove has 120 houses, all painted in HOA-approved colors, which basically means beige, light gray or slightly darker beige. The grass must be between 1 and 2 in tall. Holiday decorations can only be displayed 7 days before and 3 days after the actual holiday. And ruling over all of this with an iron fist was Dolores Kensington. Dolores was 61 years old, a retired corporate compliance officer who treated the HOA presidency like she was running a Fortune 500 company. She measured grass with an actual ruler. She had a color chart for approved mailbox posts. She once fined someone $75 because their garbage can was visible from the street for 12 minutes after pickup. That Tuesday morning started normally enough. Eleanor and I were having breakfast when she suddenly grabbed her chest. Her face went pale and she couldn't catch her breath. I called 911 immediately while helping her to the couch. The dispatcher kept me on the line, talking me through what to do until the paramedics arrived. When the ambulance pulled up, I felt relief wash over me. These professionals would help Eleanor. What I didn't expect was Dolores marching over from her house across the street, already in full enforcement mode at 8:30 in the morning. After the confrontation on my lawn, the paramedics basically ignored Dolores and continued loading Eleanor into the ambulance. She was screaming about lawsuits and violations while they were trying to save my wife's life. I rode with Eleanor to the hospital, my hands shaking with a combination of fear for her and rage at what had just happened. Eleanor was stabilized at the hospital. Thank God. The doctors adjusted her medication and kept her overnight for observation. When I got home that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, there was an envelope taped to my door, an official HOA violation notice. The letter, printed on Dolores's ridiculous letterhead with a photo of herself in the corner, listed multiple infractions: disruptive emergency procedure on a Tuesday morning, unauthorized emergency vehicle entry, damage to common area grass from heavy vehicle, excessive noise from sirens before 9 a.m., failure to submit emergency vehicle request form 7 days in advance. I thought it had to be a joke. Nobody could be this detached from reality. But then the fines started showing up. $150 for unauthorized curb damage where the ambulance parked. $200 for unothetic medical equipment deployment on front lawn. $500 for failure to notify the HOA board of guest vehicle arrival because apparently the ambulance counted as a guest. I contested every single charge at the next HOA meeting. Dolores sat at the head of the table with her two bored cronies, Patricia Humphrey and Gordon Fitzgerald, both of whom were too scared of her to ever disagree. She dismissed my protests with a wave of her hand, saying that medical emergencies were not exempt from HOA guidelines and that I should have planned better. That's when she made her first real mistake. She posted the security footage from the HOA cameras on the community Facebook page, claiming that Eleanor and I had staged the whole medical emergency to avoid an upcoming landscaping inspection. She actually wrote that my wife had faked a cardiac episode to get out of trimming our hedges. I started documenting everything. I installed my own security cameras, perfectly legal ones that covered my property. I kept detailed logs of every interaction. And then Dolores escalated things even further. 2 weeks later, Eleanor had a follow-up appointment with her cardiologist. When we returned home, there were 2 HOA security guards waiting in our driveway. Dolores stood between them with her clipboard, announcing that she was conducting a wellness check because she suspected Eleanor was committing insurance fraud by claiming to have a heart condition. She actually tried to demand Eleanor's medical records right there in our driveway. When Eleanor politely declined, Dolores declared she was making a citizen's arrest for non-compliance with HOA community safety protocols. The security guards looked uncomfortable and didn't move when Dolores ordered them to detain my wife. That night, I called my brother-in-law, who's an attorney. He listened to my story with increasing disbelief and told me to document everything and file a formal cease and desist letter. But while researching for the letter, he discovered something interesting in the public records. Dolores had been operating the HOA under an expired charter for the past 2 years. The official registration with the city had lapsed, which meant every single fine, every rule enforcement, every action she'd taken as HOA president was legally invalid. She'd been collecting fines and fees that she had no legal authority to impose, but that wasn't even the biggest issue. Interfering with emergency medical services was a serious crime, and trying to prevent EMTs from transporting a patient that was a felony in our state. I filed a complaint with the county prosecutor's office, attaching the security footage I'd saved from my cameras. It clearly showed Dolores physically trying to block the paramedics, grabbing the stretcher at one point, and threatening to have them arrested. The prosecutor's office was very interested. Meanwhile, I also contacted a local news station. A reporter named Jennifer Chong was fascinated by the story of an HOA president trying to stop an ambulance from saving someone's life. She came out to interview us, and Eleanor bravely shared her story while still recovering from her cardiac episode. The news segment aired on a Thursday evening with the headline, "HOA President Attempts to Arrest Woman During Medical Emergency." The footage of Dolores screaming at paramedics while my wife struggled to breathe viral within hours. The station's Facebook post got over 300,000 shares in 2 days. Dolores's lawyer, a guy named Mitchell Barnes, who'd been handling HOA matters for her, watched the news segment and immediately dropped her as a client. He actually sent a formal letter to the HOA board stating he could no longer represent them in any capacity and recommended they seek new counsel immediately. The county moved fast after that. The district attorney himself got involved, and Dolores was charged with interference with emergency medical personnel, reckless endangerment, and making false statements to law enforcement because she'd also called the police claiming the paramedics were trespassing. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. For the first time in 5 years, homeowners actually showed up in huge numbers. The community center was packed with angry residents who'd been bullied by Dolores for years, but had been too intimidated to speak up before. One by one, people stood up to share their stories. Tom Garrett talked about being fined $300 because his daughter's chalk drawings on their own driveway were not approved exterior decorations. Susan Way described how Dolores had measured her Christmas wreath and fined her because it was 1 in over the approved diameter. An elderly veteran named Robert Chen said Dolores had tried to find him for displaying an American flag on Veterans Day without prior approval. The board voted unanimously to remove Dolores as president effective immediately, but Dolores didn't accept it. She showed up to the next official meeting anyway, marching to the podium and declaring the board had no authority to remove her. She was in the middle of a rant about constitutional violations when two police officers walked in. They arrested her right there at the podium for tampering with emergency communications. Apparently, she'd been caught trying to reprogram the HOA emergency contact system to route all 911 calls through her personal cell phone first so she could approve them. Eleanor and I filed a civil lawsuit against both Dolores personally and the HOA for emotional distress, harassment, and negligence. Our attorney argued that Dolores's actions had directly endangered Eleanor's life and caused significant psychological trauma. The HOA's insurance company took one look at the evidence and immediately offered to settle. The judgment came back at $145,000 in damages plus attorney fees. The HOA board was also required to dissolve and reorganize under new bylaws that specifically prohibited interference with emergency services and included term limits for all board positions. But the criminal trial was where Dolores really faced the music. She stood in front of Judge Margaret Holbrook, still wearing her purple HOA president blazer like it was armor. The prosecutor played the video of her grabbing the ambulance stretcher, while Eleanor gasped for air. The judge's face grew darker with every second of footage. Dolores was found guilty on all charges. The interference with emergency services charge alone carried a maximum of 5 years in prison. Judge Holbrook, noting that Dolores had shown zero remorse and had actually tried to justify her actions during testimony, sentenced her to 18 months in prison, 3 years probation, and $50,000 in fines. The courtroom gasped when the sentence was read. Dolores's face went white, then red, then a sort of purple that matched her blazer. She actually stood up and shouted that the judge had no authority over HOA matters before her new lawyer frantically pulled her back down and whispered urgently in her ear about contempt charges.